Right, Craig, you're on if you're ready to share your screen.
Hi, Renee. So I certainly am. And
Thank you. You
good
can
evening, everybody.
have about 30 minutes or so, whatever you're comfortable with.
Okay, I'll see how we go. I'll try and bunny hop through this a bit because, we're talking about giving you really just an overview of a fairly complicated project. And then I'm very happy for people to drill down into pet topics or hot topics and question in more detail areas of particular interest, because that's what I'm really going to leave everybody with you tonight is the really an insight into the dynamics or the various aspects of running a nature-based restoration project. And that, of course, includes the really important monitoring aspects, but there's a lot of other things, and it's probably nice for people to be exposed to some of those other things as well, if they maybe haven't been exposed to them through their professional or private experiences. Just the first thing I'd like to do is just acknowledge this is a partnership project in Noosa between the Nature Conservancy and the Noosa Shire Council. So this is a really quite unique in that we work very closely with the council team, with Grant's colleagues in particular, to implement this project. And that's really important for the way the Nature Conservancy works. We really do like to and really always strive to work with government, local, state and federal, wherever possible, because the kind of work, whenever we're working in nature and we're looking at modifying nature, the implications on nature are many, and they could be long lasting, and they affect all kinds of people with all kinds of different interests. So it really has a political dimension no matter what you do. As any researcher these days will tell you, one may study to be a researcher, but very quickly one has to become a rapid politician and a public speaker and a Facebook guru, because the implications of our work are so broad, and we need to be mindful of that as we go forward. So this partnership arrangement to make sure that all the right people are involved. The project in Noosa, it's only one of our projects, and it's got a contracted period of 3 years, but I expect that it's going to last longer. No one can do nature-based restoration quickly, even though the nature of contracts and financing does sort of demand that we try to squash a lot into a short period of time. It does generally take much longer than that, and I think most people who have worked in this space for a while know that. Thank you for acknowledging the Indigenous people in Noosa. That is the Kabi or Kabi people of this region, and we are working and talking to them and making sure that they are aware and involved and are supportive of our nature restoration work. And it's really quite critical for a whole range of reasons, as most participants here tonight will know. And that's just a lovely shot, of course, of the Noosa estuary. And that is actually the part of the estuary that is not actually suitable for oyster restoration. Maybe we can explore that a bit more why later. The Nature Conservancy, I suppose, a bit like World Wildlife Fund, I'd say Nature Conservancy has a fairly low profile in Australia. The team in Australia is not as big as in other places, but in fact it actually is the world's largest conservation organisation. It's very strongly based in science, and they kind of move more like plate tectonics, often using slow, steady, methodical ways of getting work done, and just being calm and cautious about it, and not raising their profile too high along the way. And that's why perhaps some people know less about them than other international organisations. They tend to be more quieter achievers and more have a higher profile within sort of conservation and management circles. They're quite big. They're 400 scientists working over actually 72 countries these days. And they tackle a wide range of social development and environmental projects, urban and remote. And in Australia, the focus has mostly been on remote projects, looking at lots of work on land requisition and land management and partnerships. And also the restoration work has been mainly in areas away from the main city centres. But for the Australia program, the Noosa project is breaking that mould as we move into perhaps one of the most intensely used and intensely loved estuaries on the eastern seaboard, if not in the country. The TNC Australia program's oyster restoration work has been going on for the last 5 years, I suppose. And as you can see from this little list here, we have been working for the last 5 years in Port Phillip Bay in Victoria to restore oyster reefs in the bay. Gulf St Vincent in South Australia in partnership with the South Australian government and local shires there. Albany in Western Australia just finished an oyster bed in Albany. Peel Harvey Estuary, which is being under investigation at the moment, and we're about to start oyster gardening. Well, shellfish gardening, actually, they're doing mussel gardening. It's just kicked off a couple of weeks ago. And in the Swan River in Western Australia, another interesting place to have a look at if you're browsing the TNC website. But of course, this tonight we'll just kind of only hop through the Noosa River project, which I'm in charge of. There's been quite a lot of work done by TNC in this space, and I'm going to show you quickly the methodology that TNC applies and dive more into where we're up to in Noosa and what's in store for us over the next couple of years. We have refunding from the Noosa project from the Noosa Shire Council and the ratepayers of the Noosa Shire. 50% of our project money comes from that source, which is a fantastic investment from the local community of Noosa. And in this list here, particularly working with the Thomas Foundation, is providing the other half of the funding at this stage. But around Australia, there's a whole range of partnerships and contributors to the project, in kind and with direct financial contributions from state government agencies and local community members who sit on the advisory groups and give us technical advice and meet us at the coffee shop to talk about the local conditions. There's hundreds and hundreds of people involved in all kinds of capacities. That's probably the way it should be, because these are complicated projects, as I said, to affect many different people and nature itself, of course. TNC is restoring reefs around the world in partnership with many national governments and local communities. And this is just one example I put up. A fascinating looking project here, which is restoring a threatened species of oyster in Shenzhen Bay in Hong Kong. And any of our listeners tonight have been to Hong Kong. As you catch the train in from the airport to Hong Kong, you can look across the bay and see this amazing project of these amazingly vertical columns. And we tend to work in many different environments. And although the methodologies you see that I'll present tonight are reasonably consistent across the way the TNC approaches restoration, in each individual location, we have to tune and refine the methodologies to suit the particular species, the mix of species, the hydrological and physiological characteristics of the site, and of course the aspirations of the locals in terms of what they want to achieve. So there's a lot of fine tuning that goes on. Even though the methodology is relatively consistent, most of our work goes into the adaptation of the methodology for the local conditions. In Australia, you can see there's shellfish restoration going around Australia, and not all that's by the Nature Conservancy. We have a range of groups trying their hand at restoration, and with some really good success and really good learnings. The areas in green are where I just mentioned are the TNC projects at this stage, but TNC is really privileged that we have relationships with everybody who's doing restoration at the moment and sharing knowledge, sharing information, and hopefully where possible, providing some of the fundamental research and supporting some of the fundamental research through the research institutions that give us the baseline of understanding as we move forward in the restoration space. Answering fundamental questions around pathogens and threats and survivability and things that really support all the projects. And we like to see ourselves as really a shellfish restoration community of goodwill people, researchers, community people, and other private sector investors sharing and caring for each other. And it really is a very pleasant workspace if anybody's looking for a career change or a career development. It's a great space of at the cutting edge of trying to work out how to do things under really difficult circumstances, but with a lot of goodwill. And that makes one reason why I've come to work on TNC and leave that really fascinating work I was doing in the Pacific. It's just a really good space to work. What about Noosa? Well, of course, I expect many people would know Noosa, but not everyone. And this is the lower estuary. Grant showed some great photos there too, and it is a wonderful place. But this lower estuary, even though there's oysters growing here, is not a place that's really for us suitable for restoration. One question, the sands are very mobile. So when you're actually having to spend real public money on progressing restoration, you've got to look at areas where you've got the maximum chance of success. And an estuary where there's a lot of alluvial sands moving around is a particularly high risk area to work. So we will tend to stay out of an area like this, particularly in the first instance. The lower mid-estuary has a lot more promise for restoration, but of course it's an area in Noosa, for example, that on this here on the southern shore, huge and extensive use by local community and by visitors and by business operators. And so even though we know that oysters grow really well along these shorelines and survive really well, it's a space that's been cleaned up, tidied up, made presentable, made accessible for a whole raft of modern day human uses, therefore making it really quite difficult as a restoration space. But in the distance, you can see over there, we have the North Shore. We have much more preservation of natural features, natural environments, and that gives us more opportunity to look for a suitable restoration sites. Of course, Noosa is not just a place of nature and trees and sun-loving hippies. It's a whole bunch of mixed interests and uses and developments, including the canals. And interesting, the canals are a feature and a growing feature of Queensland and indeed the coast of Australia. And we have to look as restorers, as conservationists even, how we can work with these spaces, how they've modified the landscape, how they challenge nature, how they challenge nature's survival, and how can we therefore augment and maybe assist in maximising these spaces as suitable places for nature to also survive. So nature's pretty adaptive if we give it a bit of a hand, and that's what restorers do. We give nature a bit of a hand. And so of course we take an interest in restoring areas like the edges of the Noosa Channel, and of course the public has a great interest in that as well. Of course, it's much easier to look at the wild places, the places where the human footprint is lower, and this conservation park up in the Wyver Creek, an area of interest to us for restoration in Noosa. Doing restoration work adjoining natural areas means you get a lot more synergies between ecosystem types. You're more likely to have a mix of ecological processes already working, or that can therefore support restoration efforts. And of course they are of interest, but when we're moving into the east coast of Australia, we're looking at restoration, even though it looks very natural, and it is quite natural, there's a lot of great natural processes to work here, there's still a lot of human use we have to consider as well that's mixing in. There's a lot of fishing, there's a lot of bird watching, there's a lot of visitation, and of course through Cranstock we know issues around sedimentation, which is the thing that keeps me awake at night. Is still an issue up in these more natural looking areas that we have to understand it particularly at the places we want to work. What's great for a place like Noosa is that, well, the Sydney rock oyster, which is a predominant three-dimensional structure building oyster in Noosa. They do survive in the Noosa River. We see them and people see them and they think they're all healthy and fine. They see them growing on the pylons and piers. But when we talk about ecosystem restoration, it's more than just oysters growing on a pier. And I'll come back to that. Here we go. Here's some rock oysters growing on some rock armour out the front of a restaurant in the main mid-lower river channel. So people see this and go, oh yeah, there's rock oysters here. Fantastic. All's well in the world. This is not really what you call a monoculture of oysters, but it's just oysters clinging for life. It's not forming what we're looking for in the restoration space, which is an oyster-dominated ecosystem structure. And as we know, as people do reef monitoring, we understand the complexities of natural ecosystems. We're looking for an oyster-dominated ecosystem which provides the physical three-dimensional structures. But then within that, we want to see a whole mix of other species cohabiting in those spaces, competing with the oysters, and adding to sort of the complexity of an oyster system. And you're very limited with a pointy, sharp granite boulder, for example, to diversify the habitat types and to diversify, therefore, the ecosystem services and complexity that we're looking for in restoration. So, yep, they'll grow there. but it's not really an oyster-dominated ecosystem. It's just oysters growing on a rock to a large degree. There we go. A great shot. Here's a subtitle colony of rock oysters growing on a shopping trolley dragged out of the Noosa River. Of course, when we can look at the dynamics between artificial reefs and restoring more natural reefs, and just pointing to the fact that Grant pointed out that there is a great interest in Noosa for nature-based solutions and natural ways of doing things, and looking to more working with nature than using artificial means of doing work wherever we can, which is a big influence on the way we do work in Noosa. Yes, we can see oysters, like, for example, growing on shopping trolleys. And that suggests they grow, the oysters want to survive, but this shopping trolley can tell us things about why are they growing in the shopping trolley and not around all the edges of the river. This shopping trolley is elevated off the bottom, which is a really key thing. And it goes back to this comment about sediment. Sediment's a big issue in a lot of our coastal estuaries, and sediment is one of the things that prevents oysters re-establishing themselves and growing in places like Noosa. They'll grab onto a structure like this and grow, but again, they can't form that complex ecosystems that we're really looking to achieve. If we go down the artificial reef route and we go, well, let's put 300 shopping trolleys into the right. Sure, we'll get oysters growing all that. Sure, they're three-dimensional. Sure, we'll get fish and other invertebrates taking up residence. But what we're doing in that space, and we can do that, and sometimes the objective is to do that, but what we have to be mindful when we're selecting the methodology of restoration is if we get to scale, so rather than a pilot project, we're working at scale across a larger area. When we choose the substrate, when we choose the restoration medium, so the cold shopping trolley, we therefore select inadvertently the mix of species that end up dominating that system. Because species that are particularly good at colonizing this particular structure, they're the ones who will end up dominating the estuary and have flow-on effects to the way this estuary operates. And that's a consideration we should be a little mindful of, because there's always a lot of interest in artificial reefs, and they do have their place, but we have to be mindful that if we go down that route, there could be consequence of going down that route once we actually restore at a large scale as opposed to a pilot scale. And we just have to be mindful of that. One thing I haven't really said is that why are we doing this? Why bother? And some people will be aware, but some perhaps are not as aware. Oysters have been removed from our East Coast estuaries and actually all around Australia for a very long time. And we know there's a long lingering culture that most of us still alive today have some family history of culture of shucking oysters naturally off rocks somewhere and eating them. This sort of wild harvest idea. And that's been going on for a very, very long time. But of course, where there's natural wild harvest by humans, there comes industry, and that's really what has happened. Industry got into the play, and then coupled with wild harvesting of people, growing populations, and then the impact of catchment management changes, sedimentation, and the sort of cascading effects of all those human footprint interactions with oysters is we actually collapsed oyster ecosystems in Australia. It actually collapsed. And that's what we're facing today. Ten says, done the homework, we've worked with the scientists, we've done the research, and we know that over 90% of Australia's oyster reefs, that's oyster-dominated reef ecosystems, are now considered extinct. And that's no vague claim, that's a scientifically proven fact. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature has just listed rock oyster, Sydney rock oyster, and Ghazi flat oyster dominated ecosystems in Australia as critically endangered ecosystems. In Noosa, for example, rock oyster ecosystems, which were a feature of Noosa, but also the other rivers, the Sandy Straits, Maroochy River, Moreton Bay, Currumbin Creek for the south, they're virtually gone. There's very few left. And they're actually functionally extinct in most areas of southeast Queensland. There are a few areas where they're clinging on. But as you can see here this shot is from Moreton Bay, the change has been quite dramatic and quite extensive. But what we're not seeing is natural recruitment recurring. We're not seeing any natural recovery. We're seeing just this continued downward trend. And that's where the role of restorers come into play. What happens once we get onto this erosion pathway where a combination of sediments, of extraction, stresses from, say, freshwater plumes, heat waves, and perhaps also with the growing influence of climate change coming on, these cumulative impacts knock around the ecosystem functions and the ability of the system to function healthily. Like a football team. If you've got sick players in there, the whole team doesn't perform well. You can't win games. And ecosystems, you can look at it quite simply, and we know that they're not dissimilar in that way. So once they are vulnerable to disease, are vulnerable to impact, then impacts then really become quite extensive, and disease and pathogens, viruses, bacteria get greater access. They get a leg up in the system. They get to expand their influence, and then their impacts can be so devastating that the reefs just lose the ability to recover and repel those impacts naturally, and we end up with this slow long-term decline, as we know from looking at coral reefs as well. It's not that dissimilar here with the shellfish reefs. But it is a sad story. It really is a sad story. We've lost a lot of services from our shellfish ecosystem, but there are great opportunities, and in the last 10 years, there's been a growing interest and will, particularly in the non-government sector, to understand better and to trial and test and look at ways of restoring aquatic ecosystems. In our case, of course, marine ecosystems. And it's a relatively new field, but there's been a lot of work done to understand how we can go about it. And we're not world experts yet, but we're getting there. There's a lot known, and there's a lot of collaboration to help us work out how to do it. And thankfully, the governments are getting involved. The commitment from Noosa Shire Council, for example, to put real taxpayers' money in this project shows their confidence and belief that this work is important. And, I humbly accept that faith that governments have. And now we're working with governments to develop a bit more collaborative policy arena to do this work at a more larger scale. Rather than having the NGOs run it all the time, working in partnership with the governments is really critical. And in Noosa, we're going to do that. But we have to do it carefully and systematically. We have to provide confidence to the farmers, confidence to the community that we do this carefully, considered, in a systematic way using restoration methodologies. Not research methodologies, restoration methodologies. And these have had to be developed, trialled, debated, discussed, scientifically reviewed and approved. And out of that kind of work comes the International Restoration Guidelines for Shellfish Reef. And this is this methodology that TNC is applying. It's a methodology adopted by the Society for Ecological Restoration, which is internationally accredited for taking the lead on the scientific aspects of this work. And TNC helped, of course, develop those guidelines, but we made sure that they were independently and extensively reviewed to make sure that we are going in the right direction. We don't want cowboys in this space. The damage we can cause is too great. We have to be careful. There's enough risk without skipping over important steps. What are the key steps? Well, I'll bunny hop through them, but we have to make the case as to why to do it. We have to understand the decline and the local decline. We have to be careful. We have to plan very carefully in terms of goals and look at the feasibility for restoration. And I'll come back to those points. Of course, the governments are very cautious, and they should be. They're responsible for the marine estate, for the natural state of where we're working, and we have to have permits. We have to convince governments through the permitting process that we're not going to cause irrevocable harm. And the way we like to work is we want to make sure that the governments are with us in the journey of restoration, so that they learn with us and they can advise us and we can advise them, and we work as a team. And we plan together and we design for the particular environment we're working in and for the particular dominant species. And for Noosa, we know one of the critical and probably the most critical three-dimensional ecosystem engineer is the rock oyster, which occurs naturally in the Noosa River estuary. Then what we do is we go out there and we take our methodologies and our experience and our teams, and we look at the particular place like Noosa, and we get there and we trial and we look at how we best can work in that environment. And there's lots of different dynamics to doing those trials. It's not a matter of dropping some concrete blocks in the water and seeing what grows in it. It's much more convoluted. I'll touch on it very briefly. Once we have proof of method, we work out a whole bunch of methods of working. The community is comfortable that we're going in the right direction. The funders are comfortable. The scientists are comfortable. And our monitoring tells us that, yes, this has a high probability of success. Then we look at upscaling and going to full system construction, or what we call really restoration. But we're using construction methodologies applied for other systems, such as building jetties or bridges, but we're applying them in the restoration space. Of course, laying on top of all this, we have to be absolutely transparent and accountable, and that's why we have a very sophisticated and elaborate monitoring, evaluation, reporting system. But what are we aiming for? Well, we have to find a reference ecosystem, or a couple of reference ecosystems, and this is actually one out of New South Wales, out of my colleague Callum, I know, who's listening in, who's been supporting me as an intern with TNC, out of Stockton, out of Newcastle. Oyster dominant ecosystems are not always pretty. They haven't got that sort of beauty that many people would see from a coral tropical reef with the angophora corals and so forth. It's different here. It's often messy and muddy, and to the human eye, or some human eyes anyway, they're not particularly always pretty places. And so we have to look at really what was in that location and what we should maybe restore back to or restore towards. And this is perhaps one example we could look at for Noosa, where we have clumpy looking clusters of oysters. We've got channels running between oyster beds that, as they grow vertically, become oyster reefs. They have a backwater, soft sediment environment with mangroves and a mix of other habitats. And probably somewhere in there, just out of sight, perhaps in the subtile area, of course, there's going to be some seagrass, maybe some rocky reef or some other habitats that add up this quite complicated and kind of, let's say, messy system. But it's importantly messy. We know that these systems are complicated and offer a range of natural benefits or natural services and services to human interests as well. And these are often espoused. We can look at water quality because they're filthy feeding organisms, the mussels that colonize these sites. They filter toxins as well. They create complicated habitats, as we know all too well. They can stabilize sediments. They take nitrogen and phosphorus and other organic solids compounds out of the water, and they put it into the sediments where they should belong, rather than floating around in the water column, causing algal blooms. So stabilizing the health of the system. And if placed right and put into the right formats, can also play some role in erosion control. One of the great challenges for researchers and restorers alike is to never overstate the benefits. They have to be carefully calibrated to what we can actually achieve for that place. It is actually the Achilles heel of most research and restoration projects, in my experience, is overstating the benefits early in order to sell the general concept. Once we overstate them, then we get held to account for what we've overstated. And sometimes we have to eat humble pie and say, oh, sorry, we can't quite achieve all that. It's not quite working out the way we said. So what we can do is offer potential benefits, offer that we will monitor and measure successes and failures, but feed out really successes and benefits as we can measure them and not say too much up front. I think as a restorer, I'd like to share that as a really important lesson. Don't overpromise, don't generalize, because people will hold you to account. In a place like Noosa and these really tight-knit estuarine systems, we have a lot of people who know a lot about their local backyard, and professional fishermen and recreational fishermen who really know a lot. They will hold us to account for the promises we make. There are a bunch of benefits, and we try to calibrate and measure these and report these back, but they're not equal for every estuary, and they really depend on where we work. We employ construction workers. There may be benefits to commercial fishing. There will be benefits to recreational fishers, but they may not be realised within, say, a 3-year time frame of a project like ours. Oysters grow fairly rapidly. They'll spawn within 3 years of settlement. That's great. That makes them a pretty good species to work with as a primary restoration target. But to look at the benefits to fishing productivity in estuary, you're really have to be looking at a monitoring system for 5 to 10 years to measure that kind of level of contribution to an estuary. 3 years is not long enough. We can measure outputs, we can measure species presence and absence, we can measure how much water is being filtered by the mussels. But in terms of what the contribution is to overall the economics, we need to look at longer time series. That's why these projects need to be commitments for very long times. And we have to make sure we're measuring the right things so we can demonstrate the promises we've made. There's a lot in setting up an oyster project, and that's what's been happening with TNC. Our project only really started last year, but there is some history that was 5 years behind that. But there's lots of different dynamics and lots of arrangements and liabilities that have to be built. And I won't need to hover on them, but there's a lot of stakeholders to be mindful of and lots of structures and processes and people that need to be involved in technical advisory capacities that need to be brought into the system. And every single one of those people need to be equally respected and cared for and sort of involved in their respective capacities. We have to develop project management plans, very detailed, very specific. They have lots and lots of complicated dynamics to them. They have to show our methodology, our approach, our estimated milestones, all the things you expect. They are provided in great detail. And I even recently, Noosa, when council actually said, well, this is just a project management plan, that's nothing. If you've been building a house, we've been developing the systems for building houses for many, many, many years. A lot of those methodologies have been simplified down into codes of practice. You might be able to pull a project management plan off the rack for how to build a house and perhaps even just download one off the internet. But when you're looking at restoring something as complex as a natural ecosystem in a heavily used estuary, the process is very complicated and takes a lot of work to actually write the project management plan. So we have to take the stakeholders through that process. We have to take them through understanding how a MER framework, a Monitoring Evaluation Reporting Framework, works. We have to present a whole raft of goals and objectives and then show how we're going to measure against those and report on them. And the methodology we'll be applying to, and we do apply to restoration projects, is consistent across the projects. And we advise other groups to use similar methodologies so that we can compare all our results. We have metrics that measure the shellfish. We have remote sense monitoring using RUVs and RUS, remote underwater video systems, real-life surveys, methodology. We don't use multi-beam sonar in Noosa because it's too shallow. But of course, we look at the socio-economic aspects and efficiency. There's a whole presentation just on that topic. Historically, we have to go and look at the history of what the oysters are doing in the river. And there's a settlement plate study, for example, where we look at recruitment. Are the oysters spawning in the river? Are they recruiting? And in Noosa, they are. And that's what we find by doing these settlement studies. But on that, in Noosa, we've had 5 years of work. We've had the 3 years of work by the University of Sunshine Coast and the Biosphere Reserve Foundation here, working also with council and the locals, looking at ways of restoring oysters, putting oysters in coir bags, placing them in different sites in the river, monitoring recruitment, monitoring survivability, monitoring the interaction of the public with those sites. And all that has occurred before the current project that I'm managing started. And I'm really privileged to have the results of all that work to advise us now going forward of what worked in that phase, what was hard, for example, permitting, what's even harder, how the community interacts with these sites, and how do we do things the same and different going forward. Where we're up to right now in this project is we've just been doing the restoration suitability modelling to make sure that we can scientifically justify that Noosa is suitable for oyster ecosystem restoration, and it is, it resoundingly is. We know that from visual censuses we've taken, we know that from 5 years of work, and we know that from gathering all the information we know about rock oysters and what we know about the estuary, laying that up into a GIS system, putting in some envelopes of what we look at some criteria around survivability and tolerances of oysters, looking at other things that are important for restoration, say the proximity of where we want to work or the proximity of the ecosystem to existing oyster reefs, which can provide larvae to augment our restoration efforts, proximity to public infrastructure, jetties, boat ramps, proximity to navigation channels. All these things need to be considered as we try to select restoration sites. And if you look carefully at this image, you can see 5 sites identified, 5 areas or footprints. And these are the areas that we have identified using our modelling as the best sites that we think have the highest potential for oyster ecosystem restoration in the Noosa River at this stage. Doesn't mean we can't find more sites, but with the current state of knowledge and the research we've done to date, these are pretty highly likely candidates. And we will now put out to the community and find out if they will accept us to work in these areas to do some restoration work. Because as you can see, the intensity of use and love of this estuary, we have to do quite a lot of consultation, one-on-one meetings with people, and involve a lot of stakeholders and show them the results of our scientific work as well to explain why we've selected the sites and how we're going to go about it. Of course, this is a very important aspect. Of course, as you guys know from doing Reef Check, there's different ways the community needs to be involved to understand the project, to accept it, and because they just love it. They really do love restoration work. And in Noosa, we're really looking at doing oyster gardening, which is growing oysters off jetties and household off the back of houses that back onto the waterway, and we're developing that at the moment. We're doing oyster recycling because one of the ways we restore in oysters in this project is we mix oyster shell with naturally occurring or from the region igneous rubble rock, and we create a composite mix. And so there's opportunities for the community to help us with the oyster recycling work. And also by inviting us along to nights like this to talk about the project work, as well as also a contributor to the project actually, which is fantastic. Supporting us with promotional education, sharing our stories on social media, talking about the project, and helping us with monitoring wherever we're able to do that. So there's lots of opportunity. And at this stage of the Noosa project, we're just developing those systems. We have partners, of course. We have partners who have to handle and transplant our oyster shell. We have people who support us in managing where our shell's stored. We're going to need construction managers and so forth to help us to carry our restoration substrates onto site. There's a whole bunch of agencies involved, of course, and they sit on our technical advisory committee who have to advise us on the biosecurity, very big issue, of how we can work in the estuary without entering or adding risk by adding species to the estuary or adding pathogens to the estuary. And also considering the current planning and management. For example, in Noosa, we're mostly working in fish habitat areas, and that has a special layer of obligations for us. But there are also a couple of sites outside the fish habitat areas we're working as well. Here's our site on the right here at Noosa, is where we're going to be storing our oyster shell. And just the lower 2 photos are in Victoria, where we've been piling up oyster shell for a long time. This is part of the biosecurity protocol to dry the shell, to kill off pathogens before we mix it with our restoration substrates. Here's an example. We haven't got an example from Noosa because we're not up to this yet, but here's an example from our work just a few weeks ago in the Swan River, where we've got a barge, we've got a bunch of igneous rock up here. Here they're using limestone, which they deploy at very carefully marked sites in the Swan River, mixed with shell to form a restoration substrate, which is then colonised by naturally occurring oysters and mussels and other invertebrates, but which then we also augment with some seeding as well. But that's the reason. And you see they're using a long arm excavator to deploy the substrate. And what we're really doing is just providing a substrate with a bit of augmentation that looks something like the natural ecosystems did occur, or the natural shapes that would have occurred in the estuary, and which therefore the oysters will grow, and then they take over the role of colonising and forming the ecosystem. We don't do much more than that other than monitor the success, and perhaps we might augment a bit more with some more shell to provide some more rugosity where needed, or look at the sedimentation rates and add a bit more rock to raise the substrate above the sediment, which is the biggest risk because it smothers the site. But mostly we want nature to take its course and do most of the work in this form of restoration. So just a concluding slide, because I know I'm a little bit over time, but as you see, I've tried to cover a lot of ground very quickly. Here's one of our sites in Noosa that we're really interested in the Noosa Sound. We're just going to complete some detailed site surveys. For example, we've got a contractor mapping the seagrasses and other benthic habitats at our preferred restoration sites today, even in Noosa. We've got to confirm that we're allowed to work in our preferred restoration sites with the community. And then we have to design and engineer our substrate. So we couldn't just go out there and lay some igneous rock in the bottom of the estuary and the oysters may come and grow on it, but it's actually not quite that simple. We have obligations to make sure that the substrates don't move from site, that they don't wash downstream, that they don't form hazards for boat users, they don't cause erosion, they don't themselves erode away and then degrade, because these are very expensive projects. So we have a mixture of ecologists, project managers and engineers working together as a team to design the substrate, looking at what's available and engineer those substrates to meet permitting requirements and to meet our restoration objectives. Excuse me, everyone. Yeah, we have to go through quite a complicated permitting round with the government to get the approvals. We have to set up our oyster gardening. We have to also then commence our baseline monitoring and deploy our first substrates, which we're aiming to the stage between February and April next year. That's the end of it for me. I'm really happy to take any questions anybody may have.
Brilliant. Thank you, Craig. That was a whirlwind trying to keep up with that. There's so much to that project that, like you said, it was just touching on it quickly. So I guess any chance that we can let our audience know if there's any more updates as they come or other ways that they can find out, then maybe they could email you or email us so we can get in touch. I did get a few questions. I don't know, hey Shai, what sort of time should we aim to wrap up?
Probably just about 5 to 10 minutes. So if you want to run through the questions within 10 minutes, that would be good. Yeah.
Okay. So you kind of touched on them. So you might be, I'll skip those ones. And if we have time, we can get back to them. Did you consider Maroochy or Mabula rivers as potential locations for oyster reef restoration? Or was it always going to be Noosa, and if so, why?
Thank you. That's a fantastic question and really relevant because my job title is actually Southeast Queensland Coordinator. So the Nature Conservancy is very interested in working in Maroochy, Sandy Straits, and Bulletin Bay. There are other people working in those spaces, but there's plenty of room for us all to work. But what brought us to Noosa is really one of our TNC's major funders lives in Noosa and was happy to contribute substantial amount of money for us to work in Noosa in his backyard. And so it wasn't TNC's original first preferential site for Queensland. It's a fairly small and intensely used estuary, but it has given us the opportunity, in saying that, to work out how to do this work in these narrow, small estuaries. And we can learn a lot from this work. And we know in working with our colleagues at New South Wales DPI in the Fisheries Division there, that they have a lot of narrow, heavily used estuaries as well. And they're trying to think about how do they go and do restoration in those places as well. So they'll be looking to us for guidance, and we'll be talking to them about what they're learning as well. So sharing that knowledge again. And it's also the sheer enthusiasm and support of the partner, the council here, that's been willing to adopt this. Noosa Council has been a cutting edge council. They like innovation. They like to think they're green. They have masses of pressures, but they have also masses of love for their local estuary. And it makes it a really dynamic and fascinating place for us to try and do this work. But it has challenges. How are people going to interact with these restoration sites? It's a massive issue in all these estuaries. Are they just going to come and shuck all the oysters off the reefs as soon as we're finished? Maybe, Are they going to drop ankles all over them and crush them all to death? There's a whole bunch of really interesting social issues that these restoration projects raise that we have to contend with as well. And this is a good place to start trying to answer those.
Brilliant, thank you. And where are the oysters used for the restoration project sourced from?
Well, we actually can use a lot of natural recruitment. We know that the Noosa River estuary produces a lot of oyster larvae each year through just the numbers of oysters that are already growing on the mangrove roots that are growing on those rock armour and on the rubble that's around the edges. So because they're broadcast spawns and they produce a lot of larvae, the estuary's actually got quite a lot of larvae in it. So we can use natural recruitment for most of our work, but we will look to augment or kick off the restoration by maybe using adult oysters embedded into the substrate, or putting larvae or settling larvae onto some of that dried oyster through a hatchery, and then putting that spat or larvae on oyster shell, which we put onto the culch, onto the restoration sites to give it a bit of a kickstart to speed up the process. So we're contemplating the best mix, and there's a lot of logistical issues in there to consider.
Great. And do you know if there's any evidence of Pacific oysters competing with Sydney rock oysters in the Noosa Reef?
We're not aware of Pacific oysters occurring in Noosa River at all. There's quite a lot of research been going in the Noosa River. There's genetic work, there's species identification going on through Griffith University and other universities. And to this stage, we haven't seen Pacific oysters at this stage. There are, of course, a lot of tropical species that do turn up. This is a biogeographic overlap zone, so a lot of tropical species do come and occur here in Noosa, and we'll be seeing, therefore, on our reefs, a mix of oyster species. And as climate change comes along, we expect to see more tropical species on these reefs as well.
Cool. And I think there was just one, or there's a few more, but one that just came was, how can local people become involved in the project? Is there any opportunities for citizen science or your community involvement, surveys, opinions?
Of course there is, and we're working out the methodologies to do that now. What we have methodologies that we've developed from 30 years of doing this work. Tennessee's been doing this for 30 years in, say, like Chesapeake Bay, which is, of course, a high-profile restoration site at huge scale, tens and tens of hectares, where there's lots of space for people to walk around and restore, help be part of the restoration on site. But in these narrow places, we have to be a little more careful how we walk around on the sites, because just walking around the sites can wreck the sites. And so we're currently designing things like the Oyster Gardening and perhaps some real boutique monitoring systems that might be really suitable for citizen science to be involved with. And we'll plan to roll those out during next year as we get into the restoration space. And I've already have at least one check with Reef check about this, about what can we do. We will have to use contractors to do some of it. Remember, this sort of money involved in this project, for example, we have to be very careful how we gather and present information. And so some of it will be done by contractors to keep the funders satisfied that we're working with they expect. But I've been running citizen science projects for many years, and citizen science is fantastic and really valuable. So we are really wanting to build it into the framework of this in a useful way as we go along.
Cool. So if people want to find out when you do get to that stage of things, would people just keep an eye out on the TNC website, or is there a way that they can contact you?
Yes, well, they can contact me, and the TNC website's a great place. We'll develop the Noosa site much more. At the moment, it's not much more than an introduction, but we'll be adding a lot more content to that site and updates. And people can also email me, and I can add them to my mailing list. So when I start sending around updates, which I'll do a bit further down the track, they'll have more detail about what's going on. So very happy to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you. And one more that someone just pointed out that I missed. Has there been any research done in the southern Moreton Bay Island region? I'm keen to get something happening here, but want to know if it's a suitable place. Is there anything we can do as individuals to restore oyster reef?
Great to hear. It's always good to work as groups, because the process, remember, Moreton Bay is a marine park, and doing work in a marine park has lots of bristly permit conditions that are required, and lots of consultation via that marine park management process, but also there's Indigenous considerations and various legal parameters to consider. So one should always get really well advised. In southern Moreton Bay, there is interest to do work down there. I'm not aware in the far south of work going on. It's a particularly difficult place. I was down there recently, and we saw very little presence of oysters in a lot of the areas. So It's got some special considerations, and we need to do some real careful analysis to work out why we're not seeing a lot of oysters just growing even on the oyster leases. Some oyster leases have no oysters. It says there's pathogen problems. There's a whole bunch of limiting factors why the oysters aren't there. And we're going to have to work to understand that more before we spend real money. But we have got our eye on Southern Moreton Bay. I think there's great restoration potential. We just need to understand a lot more and then also secure some money to work there.
Great. Hope that answered your question, Kat. Sorry, I missed that one, but Shai just pointed it out to me. All right, we'll just take this last one and then we might wrap up here. And then if there's any further questions, they can get in touch with you via the TNC website. So the last one is, would Oyster Reef work to help water quality issues on the Great Barrier Reef?
Well, TNC is working with authority and JCU and others at the moment to look into the role that tropical oyster reef restoration can play on the reef to help with water quality. The water quality issues for the Great Barrier Reef stemming from those great big wide tropical catchments like the Burdekin, where you have massive, huge volumes of runoff. Yes, there is a role to play, but really dealing with the source of the issue is probably going to have a much bigger impact. And we know that there's been tons of studies done on water quality and sediment management and toxicology of water coming out onto the reef. And we know the main work is to deal with the source pollution, but there's a role to for oysters in that space as well. But it's expensive work, so I think we're still trying to understand how much of a contributor it can be.
Great. Well, that was a brilliant talk from both yourself and Grant. So thank you so much. Did you have either of you have anything you wanted to add before we take a group photo and wrap up?
Thank you, everybody, and thanks to Grant too for having the climate change paradigm, which scares the hell out of all of us, but there's also hope there as we understand more. So, fantastic.
Thank you.
From all of Reef Check and our audience, thank you guys so much for dedicating your time and effort on this project and to share with us tonight. The project sounds incredible, quite complex, but it sounds like it's being well managed. So thanks for sharing with us, Craig and Grant. It's great to see such great people within council who are working on this important issue, and that council's prioritizing it as well as Queensland government. So that's great.
Yeah. Thank you, Grant. Did you want to add anything?
Nope. Just thanks everyone for listening. Sorry I went so long.
No,
Okay.
sorry needed.
It was very interesting.
Sure was. So everyone, this is, like we said earlier, recorded, so it'll be published up on our YouTube page. If you are on our mailing list, you'll get an email eventually showing you to the link, or you can just search for Reef Check Australia on YouTube. Next month's talk is happening as usual, second Tuesday of the month on Zoom. I'm not certain the registration link is live yet, but it will, if it's not, it will be very soon. So jump on there on our Reef Check Australia website to register, and you'll get the Zoom link like you did for this one. All right. Thank you, everyone. Shai, could you just stop sharing for a sec? And if everyone can turn your videos on, if you want to be in our group photo, go for it. I'll give you a few seconds to get that done, and then I'll take some shots. We like to see, we've lost some people. We had, I think, in the low 50s, but they must have had to go to sleep or do something more important. All right, if you want to get any more videos on, I'm going to take some screenshots. Alrighty, 1, 2, 3, everyone smile. Cool, and I'll just make sure I get the second page as well. And again, 1, 2, 3. All right, brilliant. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for joining us. We loved having the engagement and the questions. Oh, and the last thing, we've got 2 more talks left, October and November. If you do have any particular speakers or topics in mind that you would like to listen to, feel free to email us, FEQ Events, the email that Shai shared earlier. Shai, maybe you could add that to the chat. I don't remember. Or what is it?
Yep,
FEQ Event. Thank you. Yeah, we try to think of speakers and topics that we are interested in, we think you might be too. But if you've got someone in mind that you think others would be, we'd love to have some help brainstorming, and we'll get in contact with those people for next year. I'm talking about, we try to plan way in advance. I think I contacted Grant in December of last year, or January, but yeah, it does a lot of forward planning. So we'd love to hear your opinions. And yeah, so thank you everyone. Have a good night, stay safe, look after each other, and we'll see you next
Thanks,
time.
Craig.
Thanks very
everyone.
much.
Thanks.
Cheers.